But Alexander faced another threat. The powerful Persian fleet could easily invade Greece and Macedonia in his absence. He had to destroy it. As his own navy was no match for the enemy, he fought on land. By occupying key ports, he cut off the fleet's supplies and neutralized its power. Alexander was now free to head inland and seek out Darius. Darius had used his time wisely, raising troops from his many provinces and hiring mercenaries from Greece. A huge force of up to 200,000 men gathered at Babylon. Since the future of his throne was at stake, Darius decided to lead the army personally. The Persian king, accompanied by his wife, mother, children, and harem, set out from Babylon to confront the young Macedonian. As Darius went north, Alexander headed south and brought his 35,000 men through the Taurus mountains and into the fertile plains on the Mediterranean coast. Here he replenished his stocks.
Alexander did live off the land. He lived off the well-organized system of supplies that supported the Persian provincial capitals. And Alexander has the military muscle to grab these, to claim them for himself, to exploit them. And that's how his army is able to keep on the march. It would have been very difficult at some points for his army to go back on their tracks, because there wouldn't have been any food. He has grabbed what there was and the army has eaten it. He's got to go on.
Having approached each other at the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, the two armies set up camp, either side of the Amanus Mountains. Darius had chosen to fight on a wide open plain where his numerical advantage could be decisive. There he waited, but Alexander failed to appear. With winter approaching and supplies running low for his large army, Darius had little choice but to break camp and go in search of his enemy. Alexander began to march along the coast. But unknown to both, as Darius went north, Alexander passed him on the other side of the mountains, going south. Reaching the village of Issus, Alexander established a camp for his wounded and sick troops before moving on. When Darius reached the coast, he was surprised to discover that Alexander's army had already passed that point. Hurrying after him, he arrived at Issus, where he had the hands of Alexander's sick troops cut off so they would never fight again. Then he continued south until stopping on the northern bank of the river Panaris. Alexander was amazed when informed that the Persians were only a day's march behind him. But unperturbed, he simply turned his army around.
Alexander's moves and decisions before the Battle of Issus show him emerging as a great commander. First of all is his total determination to force a major battle as the only way in which he is going to get the results he requires in the particular campaign, and even though he is facing, of course, a much larger opponent. But also a point before the Battle of Issus I particularly admire is the way in which he was not thrown by the sudden arrival of totally unexpected intelligence to the effect that Darius and his army was behind him rather than in front of him. Now, that is usually a very unfortunate circumstance to find the enemy operating on your lines of communication. Alexander, though, is a kind of man who welcomed this opportunity and immediately set about to make the most of the changed situation.
From dawn the next day, Alexander marched until he could see his formidable opposition on the horizon. He was outnumbered 6-1, perhaps more. Darius had raised a huge force of approximately 10,000 cavalry and 200,000 infantry. Alexander had over 5,000 cavalry, but only 30,000 infantry. He was nevertheless sure that before the day was out, his opponent's army would have been destroyed. The Battle of Issus changed the course of history. Along this stretch of river, how was Alexander able to defeat a force so much larger than his own? Alexander owed a great debt to his father, for Philip had trained his young recruits to march with speed and fight with skill. He created a year-round professional army without equal.
We've got organized armies for the very first time in history. When we say for the very first time, of course, I'm talking about a very broad sweep of period. The ancient Egyptians, the Hittites and others, of course, had armies before Alexander's day. But there was a certain sophistication beginning to develop, which is going to continue in much the same general format for the next 1,000 years or so from Alexander onwards. There are roles for soldiers, there are cavalry, there are infantry, there are artillerymen firing the rudimentary artillery of their period, there are supply trains. All the requirements of armies, right way down to Napoleon at least, are present in Alexander's army.
Horses and men gleaming, not with gold, not with multicolored clothes, but with iron and bronze. It was an army ready to stand its ground and follow its leader, and not overloaded with numbers and baggage. An army eagerly watching not just for a signal from Alexander, but even for a nod. Any location sufficed for their camp, any food for their provisions.
In addition to the cavalry and front-line infantry, both sides also had slingers, archers, and javelin throwers, whose role was to weaken the enemy before the battle began in earnest. But the core of an army was its infantry, and Alexander had another advantage in that the Persians used a traditional method of fighting.
It's strictly speaking a very defensive system, where you've got heavily armed infantrymen armed with a spear and a round shield, and they stand shoulder to shoulder and they fight using the spear overhand, fighting between the darts that are left between the round shields. It's very much a defensive formation. The Macedonians had developed an entirely different type of formation, which was essentially aggressive. The soldiers were armed with a very, very long pike, 20 feet long, which they held in two hands, underarm, and because of the length of the pike, the points of the first 5 rows of spears all stuck out of the front of the phalanx. And when they charged, the other side had to get beyond 15 feet of points before they could actually reach the first person in the phalanx. And the phalanx literally ran across them and ran them down like a tank.
Having brought an army to the site of battle, the key to success often lay in the manner in which the troops were deployed. Darius felt confident in his numerical superiority. He established his infantry in a defensive position on the edge of the steeply banked river, then massed virtually all of his 10,000 cavalry by the sea. This cavalry was to launch an all-out strike across the shallow river mouth and encircle the Macedonians from behind.